So Justin, thank you once again for agreeing. We thought it would be, a good excuse to welcome you beforehand, I suppose, no, in this really strange and weird way. But if we can, why shouldn't we? So yeah, thank you very much for being with us, and a warm welcome from everyone. And yeah.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. I'm sort of nice to see some of your faces, at least, several months in advance of actually showing up. But okay, what I'll do is I'll share my slides with you just so you can, or I'll share my screen with you. 1 second, sorry. Sorry, I have to remember how to share my, oh yeah, here. I have to share my, okay, can everyone, well, not yet. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep, it was great.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, yes. So thanks so much for having me, and lovely to see some of your faces, and hopefully we'll get to talk. But yeah, this is going to be more informal, I think, than the way I've given this talk in the past. Partly because I'm going to try to press you to give me some. Well, actually, I just want some help. If anyone's a game theorist, it would be lovely to get some help from them toward the end. So I'm going to tell you about this project I have. This is a sort of foundational paper in a project called A Theory of Manipulative Speech. So I hope you enjoy. Okay, so we know that so much of the speech we encounter, especially in public discourse, aims to manipulate us. So speech online, speech in all public fora, in marketing, advertising. So we know that speech is sort of aiming to manipulate us. And we know that manipulative speech can cause serious social harm. So on most views, manipulative speech is a component of propaganda, and propaganda has the sort of capacity to undermine our agency, work against our interests, and even so, and do this sort of on a massive scale. So you'd think that manipulative speech is this sort of important form of speech, but neither philosophy of language nor linguistics has a general account of what manipulative speech is, how it works, or the variety of forms that it can take. Oh, sorry. So I think the reason for this is that we have these, so we have a theory of conversation in pragmatics, philosophy of language, and linguistics, and conversation is standardly treated as a joint activity in which interlocutors cooperatively and publicly pursue a certain goal, the goal of sharing knowledge. And then on the other hand, we have a theory of manipulation that comes out of ethics and sort of political philosophy. And manipulation is standardly treated as a way of influencing people against their own interests. And it's often seen as operating covertly or by means of deception. So there seems to be this kind of incompatibility between our sort of general theory of conversation, which involves is cooperative and public, and manipulation, which is neither. So this is the kind of impasse. I think that's why nobody has developed a kind of general theory of manipulative speech. Okay, so this is the kind of overview of the project. So I want to develop a general theory of what manipulative speech is and how it operates. That's part of what I will talk about today. Investigate the variety of forms that manipulative speech can take. Construct models of manipulative speech and its varieties using the tools of formal pragmatics. This is the part that I'm sort of pushing quite hard on right now. And then there are several projects that I might talk about a little bit at the end, examining the consequences of this view of manipulative speech for our understanding of propaganda in public discourse, and sort of the public forum more generally. So, okay, so this talk is going to give you part of just the sort of foundational components of that project. So first I'll talk about manipulation and the Gricean model of conversation. Then I'll talk about what strategic speech is. Then I'll use my sort of account of what strategic speech is to develop an account of manipulative speech. And then I'll discuss a sort of general way of modeling manipulative speech using the tools of game theoretic pragmatics. And then if I have time in the last section, I'll talk a little bit about how I can turn this definition of manipulative speech into a novel and I think pretty plausible account of what propaganda is. And so I call the section on manipulative speech and public discourse. Okay, so let's go. So manipulation and the Gricean model of conversation. So what is manipulation, first of all? It's this term we hear all the time, but it's really actually hard to come by a clear definition of it. So I'm going to give you a couple of representative quotes, and hopefully from this I'll be able to extract a working definition. So Joseph Raz, for instance, says, manipulation, unlike coercion, does not interfere with a person's options. Instead, it perverts the way that a person reaches decisions, forms preferences, or adopts goals. So manipulation is often contrasted both on the one hand with rational persuasion and on the other hand with coercion. So manipulation doesn't force you to do anything, but it's also sort of an influence on deliberation that is not fully rational. So I take Raz to be sort of, this isn't a clear definition, but he's kind of offering maybe some constraints on an account of manipulation. But Claudia Mills has a slightly, maybe a slightly more developed view. She says, we might say then that manipulation in some way purports to be offering good reasons, when in fact it does not. A manipulator tries to change another's beliefs and desires by offering her bad reasons disguised as good, or faulty arguments disguised as sound, where the manipulator himself knows these to be bad reasons and faulty arguments. So Mills here is portraying manipulation as a form of influence that operates by disguising some consideration as one that works to the benefit or to the advantage of the person who's being manipulated, but in fact works sort of against them, or is not actually a good reason for them to undertake a certain action. So there's a huge debate about what manipulation is, or sort of a long-standing debate. What I'm going to do is try to extract something like a working definition out of this. So manipulation seems to be a form of influence that poses as being in someone's interest, but is in fact not in their interest. That's the kind of general characterization. And this yields an initial rough proposal. Manipulation is influence that is covertly non-cooperative. So it looks like it's cooperative, but in fact so it's influence that looks like it's sort of working towards someone's goals, but in fact is working against them, or is not ideal for pursuing their goals. So on this view, manipulators are like false friends. They aim to appear cooperative, but they're in fact pursuing some their own conflicting goals, ulterior goals. And they're successful just to the degree that they can get you to believe that their sort of influence, or what they're trying to, what their actions are in fact consonant with your goals. Okay, so now let's turn to the Gricean model of conversation. So it's familiar, but I sort of, the general outlines, 3 components. First, we have reflexive intentions. So a speaker means something by an utterance, just in case they utter those words intending to bring about a certain effect on the audience. And they want to be recognized, they want to bring about this effect partly on the basis of being recognized as intending that they want to bring about this effect. So there's this kind of publicity component of Gricean intentions. Part of their content is that they be recognized and that the effects are realized by means of this recognition. So second, communication is successful just in case the audience recognizes the speaker's intention. And third is implicature. This is sort of a broad category, but sometimes speakers mean things that differ from what they say. And in these cases, what they mean is, in general, is recoverable by audiences through reasoning about the goals of rational agents engaged in conversation. So if I mean something different from the meanings of the words that I utter, there is some process of reasoning about the goals of rational agents in conversation that will allow you to get at what I do mean. Okay, so there are a couple of important kinds of principles that make precise or sort of spell out how audiences recover speakers' meaning in situations where they mean things that are different from what they say. So this is the first principle, and well, this sort of helps Grice locate conversation in the theory of rational human activity more generally. So the first one is the cooperative principle. So you know it well. Make your contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you're engaged. So Grice thinks that conversation is a kind of goal-directed activity, maybe a joint activity. And then he spells, I'm not going to dwell on these that long, they're probably familiar, but he spells out what it is to be cooperative by specifying a collection of maxims. These are kind of like constraints or what audiences can reasonably expect from a speaker who is being cooperative. So that they'll speak truly and with sufficient evidence. They'll give enough information and not too much. They'll say things that are relevant, and then the manner is the kind of garbage can of the maxims. Everything else, be a good speaker. Don't say things that are ambiguous. Don't talk too much. Anyway, okay. So I think that some people don't actually like the maxims as sort of spelling out the cooperative principle. I think there's a simple way of spelling out cooperativity that's you'll see is sort of operative in the game theoretic framework I'll introduce later. So cooperativity can be stated as ensure that your speech acts in the conversation contribute optimally to the goal of the conversation. So this is a kind of just a simple idea that certain utterances are optimal for pursuing certain goals, and cooperativity enjoins speakers to be cooperative and then allows audiences to presume that speakers will speak optimally for that goal. Okay. There's another principle, though, that's, I think, a sort of related or twin principle for implementing the Gricean program, and that's what I call publicity. So I phrase it, this is taken from Zoltan Szabo, ensure that it is common knowledge what speech acts are performed in the conversation and what the goal of conversation is. So the reason publicity is so important is that if you don't know what the goal of the conversation is and you don't know what speech act is performed, there's no way to tell whether or not your interlocutor is being cooperative, right? So if you can't tell whether your interlocutor is being cooperative, you can't calculate implicatures. So you need to be able to know. And this is sort of implicit in the reflexive intentions that Grice, Grice always thinks that we need to make our speech acts public. And so this is a kind of, Grice doesn't state this explicitly, but I think it's actually necessary. Anyway, it won't play a huge role in the definition that we'll see, but I think it's present in the Gricean program. Okay, so the last question is, well, what's the goal of conversation? Okay, so I think that most people working in the Gricean tradition take the goal of conversation to be sharing knowledge. Grice himself says that in most cases, the goal of conversation will be to share information. But I think knowledge is slightly stronger. So the goal of conversation is to share private knowledge pertaining to a topic of common concern. So basically, interlocutors cooperate with respect to the goal of sharing knowledge insofar as their interests are sort of both served by sharing knowledge and sort of communicating successfully. Okay, so those are the kind of three pillars of the Gricean program: cooperativity, publicity, and both cooperativity and publicity are defined in terms of sharing knowledge. Okay, so let's call that the kind of standard framework for thinking about conversation in the philosophy of language. Okay, the problem is that, as you know, lots of speech doesn't conform to that model. While speakers may sort of audiences may by default sort of expect speakers to be cooperative, and speakers may be under some pressure to be cooperative, much speech is not fully cooperative. And that's, as we'll see, strategic speech is just that speech. So consider the following strategic situation: politics. A politician speaks to his constituency at a town hall. The people in his constituency are interested in getting straight answers concerning his policies and positions so they can evaluate whether his actions will further their interests. His interest, however, is in getting his constituents, as many of them as possible, to vote for him, while also keeping his policy options open once in office and limiting his accountability for lies. So the politician wishes to speak in a way that maximizes votes and minimizes commitments. So this is a kind of strategic situation where the politician has certain kinds of goals that may mean that he speaks in a way that is not sort of fully in line with the goal of sharing knowledge. Okay, second situation, sales. I'm selling you an antique. You want me to share my knowledge concerning the value of the antique because you want me to pay only as much as it's worth. You want to pay me only as much as it's worth. but I want you to pay me more than the item is worth. In fact, I want you to pay me as much as I can get you to pay. So in such a goal, my monetary goal makes it so it's not rational for me to be fully cooperative with respect to the goal of sharing knowledge concerning the antique's value. Rather, it's rational for me to speak in a way that gets you to give me as much money as possible. Okay. Third situation, a little more specific from the courtroom, in the courtroom or in a legal setting. So cross-exam. Prosecutor says, "Do you have any Swiss bank accounts, Mr. Bronston?" Bronston says, "No, sir." Prosecutor, "Have you ever?" Bronston says, "The company had an account there for about 6 months in Zurich." The prosecutor says, "Thank you, Mr. Bronston. No more questions." It's a real case, in fact, and it turned out that quite a bit later, the prosecutor went back and tried to convict Bronston of perjury, and they couldn't convict him. Anyway, we'll see more about that case a bit later. Last situation, jealous inquiry. Justin is jealous of Janet. He says, "Have you been seeing Valentino this past week?" And Janet says, "Valentino has mononucleosis." Right? So all of these responses, both Janet's response, "Valentino has mononucleosis," and Bronston's response, "The company had an account there for about 6 months in Zurich," and the kinds of things that you would say in antique sale and in the politics situation are all sort of strategic responses, right? They're not optimal for the goal of sharing knowledge. And so here's a definition of what strategic speech is. Strategic speech is speech that is deliberately less than fully cooperative with respect to the goal of sharing knowledge because it pursues some conflicting goal. So what I call a non-communicative goal. So in the situation where, Valentino, so clearly Janet has the goal of not being found out as having hung out with Valentino if she did, right? But she also has the goal of not outright lying. She doesn't want to outright lie. So there are some goals, there's some goals that conflict with the goal of sharing knowledge that push her to speak strategically. The same thing with Bronston. Bronston doesn't want to outright come out and say, he doesn't want to outright lie because he'll be convicted of perjury. But he also doesn't want to come out and say, he doesn't want to say, "Yes, I did have an account. Yes, I did have a bank account in Zurich." So he wants to get the prosecutor to calculate an implicature. That's his kind of optimal strategy. Okay, so these are all instances of strategic speech, cases where speakers speak in ways that are not perfectly or optimal, not optimal for pursuing the goal of sharing knowledge. Okay, so here's a little more precise definition of what it is for a speaker to utter some words with a strategic linguistic intention. So speaker utters words with a strategic linguistic intention if and only if S intends that the utterance cause the receiver or cause the audience to undertake some course of action, A. In order to fulfill the intention in S1, S utters you intending to be less than fully cooperative with respect to the goal of conversation, G. And S3, the speaker intends those first two things, S1 and S2, because S has a goal that conflicts with the goal of conversation, G. So here I'm sort of going to presume all along that G is the goal of sharing knowledge, but it need not be. We could also imagine other kinds of goals if you think that that's a little bit artificial. That's something we can talk about in the Q&A if you want, what exactly the goal of conversation is. Okay. So now we have a definition of strategic speech on the table. It's a definition given in terms of conflicting goals of speaker and audience or sender and receiver. So now I want to talk about what makes strategic speech manipulative, or what makes speech manipulative. So each of the situations above are ones in which speakers have reason to speak strategically. They have some non-communicative goal, but their speech is often going to be most effective when it's not recognized as being strategic. So when its strategic nature is hidden and it's taken to be, in fact, fully cooperative. So if speakers can get the audience to presume that they're in fact cooperative, speakers will use this sort of process of inference to draw certain conclusions that might not be optimal, or interpret speakers in ways that might not be optimal for the audience's purposes. Okay, so the idea is that manipulative speakers, as opposed to merely strategic speakers, hide the fact that they're being strategic. So this is what makes, so manipulative speech, as opposed to strategic speech, is covert, or has an element of covertness to it. Okay, so there's one well-known definition of what covert speech is in the literature, and that's given by Jenny Saul. So a covert speech act, so her definition is the top one. A covert speech act is a speech act that can bring about its perlocutionary aim, so the sort of the effect that it wants to bring about, only if it is not recognized by the audience as being that speech act. So for instance, a lie cannot bring about its aim of deceiving someone if it is recognized as a lie. Similarly for misleading, similarly for many other kinds of speech acts. So I think that that's a relatively narrow definition. And I have my own preferred definition, which is version 2, that actually subsumes Saul's definition as a special case. So I claim that covert speech, so a token speech act is covert if and only if it can bring about its perlocutionary aim, only if the goal with which that speech act is undertaken is not recognized by the audience. So if there's some goal that a speaker has in undertaking a certain kind of speech act, one that conflicts with the goal of sharing knowledge, the speech act can bring about its perlocutionary aim only if that goal remains hidden. So the goal being that I'm interested in, avoiding jail time or getting extra money or whatever that non-communicative goal might be. So so covert speech involves hiding one's goal and making it appear that one's speech is sort of fully cooperative. So using this definition of covertness, we can define manipulative speech as speech that is covertly strategic. So a manipulative speaker pursues a non-communicative goal, one that conflicts with the goal of sharing knowledge, while aiming to appear fully cooperative and so hide the true goal of her speech. Okay, so then we have the same kind of definition in terms of speaker's intentions. A speaker S utters U to R with a manipulative linguistic intention if and only if, first, S intends that U cause R to undertake some course of action, A. In order to fulfill the intention in S1, S utters U intending first to be less than fully cooperative with respect to the goal of the conversation, G, the goal of, in this case, the goal of sharing knowledge. And second, intending that R believe that in uttering what she does, S is being fully cooperative with the goal of the conversation. And 3, S intends both of those things because S has some goal, G prime or G star, that conflicts with the goal of the conversation. Okay, so that's the basic definition. So then we can say that manipulative speech is speech or some speech uttered with manipulative linguistic intentions. Okay, so now we see that manipulative speech involves a deliberate, coordinated violation of the 2 core Gricean norms for conversation. So it involves strategically violating the principle of cooperativity, so saying something that is not optimal for pursuing the goal of the conversation. And it involves a violation of publicity because it involves an attempt to hide one's true goal. Uh-oh. Sorry, the lights have gone out. Okay, good. Okay, good. They're on a timer. They're 20-minute timers. It's horrible. Okay, stop me if I'm going too fast or if I'm, I don't know if I'm sort of rushing to get through some of the material at the end, but okay. So it also involves a violation of publicity. Why? Well, because it involves an attempt to hide the goal that one is actually pursuing in speaking as one does. So one wants to appear cooperative, but in fact, one has this ulterior goal that one is pursuing. Okay, so now this gives us a kind of formula for what manipulative speech is, or for generating new forms of manipulative speech. It actually is a sort of predictive formula. So if we take the Gricean maxims as a guide or as a rough guide to what qualifies as cooperative, then any way of deliberately violating a maxim will qualify as an instance of strategic speech. So violations of quantity, quality, relation, manner, when they're done sort of in pursuit of some goal that conflicts with the goal of sharing knowledge, will qualify as strategic. But whenever such a violation is hidden and the audience takes the speaker to still be fully cooperative, then the speech will qualify as manipulative. So there's a kind of deception about goals here, which is the key feature of manipulative speech. And so we can now go through the Gricean maxims and actually generate or predict new forms of manipulative speech. Okay. So now I'm just going to give you a bunch of examples. So suppose we're in the antique sale case. How much is the example worth? Or you ask me, how much is the table worth? And I say, at least $500, and even that's a steal. It's sure to appreciate. So this is probably, suppose I'm just like lying, right? It's actually worth $300. Here, I'm trying to get you to think that I'm being fully cooperative and that my speech is in fact fully truthful, right? So violation, so that like, since quality is one of the Gricean maxims, speaking true, cooperativity requires speaking truly. I'm trying to get you to believe that my speech act here is in fact true and instrumental to your goals, right? You might not believe me, of course, but maybe I do some things to boost my credibility. But surely lying is at least manipulative speech by our definition, because it's intending to hide that one is deceiving someone. So one is intending to hide that the speech is not fully cooperative. Okay, so misleading, same case. How much do you think it's worth? Well, it's the best work of the head carpenter in the court of Louis XV, and other pieces of his go for at least $500, right? So if I can get you to think that this is worth at least $500 on the basis of inferring from what I said that this is relevantly similar, then I've again misled you. So this is not optimal, because I haven't just told you what it's actually worth, which would have been, what I should have done to comply with the goal of sharing knowledge. Instead, I've said something non-optimal in the hope of getting you to infer something that's not true. So an instance of misleading. And this needs to be hidden, right? You need to think that I have your best intentions at heart and wouldn't say this unless I really genuinely believed that it was worth more than $500, or at least $500. So again, misleading qualifies as manipulative by our definition. So more misleading, back to Braunston and the prosecutor. So the idea, so when the prosecutor asks, have you ever had a bank account, a Swiss bank account, Braunston says the company had an account there in Zurich, right? That's a violation of the maxim of relevance, right? But if the prosecutor presumes that Braunston is cooperative, then the prosecutor will reason, well, why would he say that, right? He wouldn't say that unless that were, he meant that he had never had a bank account there. And then, if he's cooperative, maybe the prosecutor will come to accept that, in fact, that's true. And that seems very much like what actually happened. So Braunston is deceiving the prosecutor about whether or not he's being cooperative. Okay, same thing with jealous inquiry. So if Janet can convince Justin that she's fully cooperative, then he will go on to calculate an implicature, because what she says is not relevant. It's not a direct answer to his question, right? But she'll go on to calculate an implicature that and treat Janet's, he'll go on to treat Janet's claim as an indirect response to his question, as implicating a negative answer. And then he might go on to accept it, actually, accept the relevant implication, if he thinks she's being cooperative enough, if he trusts her enough. Okay. So now there are many other cases, I think, of manipulative speech. So I think technical jargon is another example. So how much do you think it's worth? And you say, well, this is an extraordinarily valuable mid-18th century French gueridon from the Chateau Champagne. Anyway, you like go on and on, give someone so much information or things that you know that they won't, that they might not understand or recognize the significance of, in an effort to sort of blow their hair back. So this is actually what my friend Mike Deegan calls stupefying, trying to get people to accept claims without fully understanding them. And I think that stupefying with technical jargon is certainly an example of manipulative speech, because it relies on the idea that well, the speaker is being cooperative. That's why I'm going to accept accept what he says, but I'm going to accept it even though it's not optimal. It violates Grice's maxim of manner. Okay. So then dog whistling. So dog whistles are obviously strategic in the sense that there's a kind of known, so I'll read George Bush's example, or the example, yet there's power, wonder-working power in the goodness and idealism and faith of the American people. So there's a famous example, wonder-working power is a snippet from this famous evangelical hymn. I mean, I'm sure Justin knows about this. But so that was deliberately chosen by Bush's speechwriters, and they even admitted that they chose it deliberately to evoke this sort of bit of evangelical, lore, I guess, or sort of as a sort of shout out or shibboleth to evangelicals. So that's a strategic choice. But of course, like if it's recognized as being a special or a specific sort of message intended for a subset of the audience, then it won't have its intended effect. So it also has to be covert, at least with respect to a large subset of the audience. So I think dog whistling is both strategic and covert. So again, I think dog whistling counts as manipulative. Okay, then there's my kind of hobby horse, which is manipulative under specification. So consider political sort of claims like, I think we should do everything in our power to keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. So this clearly drastically underspecifies the proposition that it underspecifies its meaning, even relative to context. So wrong is sometimes what's called an essentially contested concept, and everything in our power. We don't know what the quantifier is supposed to range over. It could have any number of different meanings. So quantifier domain restriction is sort of context sensitive. And then here we can trade. Everything in my power might be, literally ban guns completely, or it might mean, everything consistent with the literal wording of the Second Amendment or whatever. So the same thing with the Democrats and Republicans are like Coke and Pepsi. They come in different packaging, but on the inside, they're the same. So that's subtle. It's more subtle in the other case because what we need here in order to fully specify the proposition expressed is to say which respects, what are the respects in which Democrats and Republicans are the same? The same in all respects? Certainly not. The same in most? Some? Which ones? So we've sort of strategically omitted some information, strategically underspecified our meaning. But if the audience believes that we're cooperative, the audience will often infer or read in a specific piece of information or a specific intention. So they'll read in a more specific content. Like they might think that I intend to say, we need to get guns out of the hands of anyone who doesn't have a license, or they'll read in maybe a preferred interpretation or the interpretation they expect. And same thing with the second example. So again, this is an instance of manipulative speech. So it's strategic under specification, and then it's aiming to be hidden because I'm aiming to convince you that I sort of am cooperative, or there's a background of cooperativity. Okay, last example, backdoor speech acts. We can't let the huge progress that we've made with North Korea be ruined by the Democrats. They're trying to undo a great deal. I just made that example up, but it sounds a lot like Trump, so I felt pretty good about it. So here, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with what are called backdoor speech acts. So in backdoor speech acts, some crucial piece of information is introduced in what's called the not at issue content. And one way of doing this is to put some piece of information in a presupposition, as opposed to in the sort of what the content that's asserted. So here, we can't let the huge progress. So that there's a presupposition that there has been huge progress, and so this actually makes it difficult for audiences to. So putting content in a presupposition makes it hard for audiences to reject, because they have to say, wait. It's not even that I disagree. It's like one of your presuppositions is flawed. They have to stop the whole conversation. So this is actually a sort of strategy for getting claims across without directly asserting them, and often we can hide these sort of presuppositions by keeping people from attending to them. So this is one of the ways that I think sort of backdoor speech can be so insidious. People don't attend as fully to not at issue content as opposed to at issue content. So this can be a kind of sneaky way of putting things into the common ground or getting people to accept claims without fully or properly evaluating them. So this is again a form of manipulative speech, because it's strategic in a way that we can spell out by it doesn't, it cuts off a range of answers to the question that we're discussing, for instance. But it's also aimed to be seen as cooperative, where it's aimed to be go unnoticed that we've snuck something into a presupposition. Okay, so those are a kind of litany of examples. So what emerges from those examples is that in each case, the mechanism by means of which manipulative speech operates is by exploiting what I call linguistic trust. So linguistic trust is basically trust that the speaker shares our goal for the conversation. Or another way of putting it is trust that the speaker is being cooperative. So against a background of linguistic trust, or against a background belief that the speaker is being cooperative, we'll end up doing all sorts of things, giving the speaker a sort of, so it leads us to accept lies and claims that are not adequately justified. So if we trust a speaker, then we're going to sort of accept their claims and undertake the corresponding actions. We also will interpret utterances in ways that are overly charitable. So if we know what the facts are and we presume that somebody is being cooperative, then we'll interpret them as having spoken truly. So we'll also calculate implicatures where we shouldn't, as in all of the cases of misleading. So if you presume that a speaker is being cooperative, then you'll try to make what they say come out, sort of consonant with the goals that you think they have. And you may have to do that by calculating an implicature. So you may treat deliberately vague statements as expressing something precise, as in the underspecification cases, accept claims that you don't fully understand, and accommodate presuppositions where you shouldn't. So this all happens by virtue of this, what I call this kind of background trust that speakers share our goals. So that's the key mechanism, I think. And good manipulative speakers will try to maximize or sort of foster and exploit linguistic trust. So they'll try to take advantage of the default presumption of cooperativity. So often there is this kind of default presumption that speakers are cooperative. They might use forms of speech that increase linguistic trust. So they might speak in a kind of down-home, folksy sort of way. And they'll take they can also do this by taking advantage of differentials in power, authority, expertise. So I think that there are all sorts of ways that speakers can actually get audiences to trust them more than they ordinarily would, sort of to increase or foster their trust, which can then be exploited. Okay. Okay, so now I think I've done okay on time. So now's the kind of that's the kind of, broad philosophical background. But what I'm sort of trying to do now is develop a quite clear formal model that exhibits what I want, exhibits this sort of covert strategy. And it turns out that there's not one ready to hand in the literature and game theory. There are instances of particular people talking about implicature in the general way that I'm going to show you, but there isn't anyone who has talked about manipulation generally and tried to give develop a kind of overarching model that fits a wide range of cases. So that's what I'm going to try and do right now. And please stop me at any point if anything isn't clear here. And hopefully we can discuss this together a lot in the Q&A too. So, okay, so in the literature and game theoretic pragmatics, the sort of basic tool is what's called a signaling game. So basically all work in game theoretic pragmatics is built around this. So a signaling game, this is much more complicated. It looks much more complicated than it actually is. So it's a tuple, there's a sender and a receiver. There's a set of types, T, that's just a set of states of the world that the sender knows, but the receiver doesn't know. There's a probability distribution that the receiver has. So he has some sort of prior credences about which state of the world is actual. Then there's a set of messages, M. There's some kind of interpretation function that says which states those messages are true in. Then there's a set of actions that the receiver can take. And then there are utility functions for the sender and the receiver. So this is basically a sort of miniature model of conversation. Okay, yeah, so the interpretation function is a function from messages to the power set of the possible types or the power set of the possible states of the world. You'll see how this is implemented relatively quickly. It just, the semantic meaning of the messages is the set of all states in which it's true. A is the set of response actions. We'll talk more about those. So people in game theoretic pragmatics leave open exactly what actions are. So sometimes they're intended to be interpretations of your utterance. Sometimes they're intended to be actions that people undertake on the basis of having or supplying a particular interpretation. Other times they're just left undefined altogether. And then utility functions are functions from the state of the world, the message sent, and the action undertaken to the real numbers. Okay, so I'll try and make this intuitive. Okay, so consider the following, what's called a quantity implicature, a Q implicature. I saw some of Bob's children at the market. So typically, because some and all are seen to be on this scale, some being weaker than all, one will implicate two. So the fact that I saw some of Bob's children implicates that I did not see all of his children, even though some is true in the case where I saw all of his children. So the most basic, I think, signaling game or application of game theoretic pragmatics tries to formalize this implicature. So, okay, so here's what's called the sum-all game. The sum-all game is a model of the context of utterance for I saw some of Bob's children at the market. So this game here has two types, the state where you saw some but not all of Bob's children, and the state where you saw them all. So those are on the left, those are the rows. Then in the columns, we have some prior probability distribution over the types on the part of the receiver. We have two potential actions that the receiver can take. We can just think of these as interpretations for the moment. He can either interpret the speaker as saying, or undertake the action that he takes when he interprets the receiver as saying some but not all. And then there's the action that he undertakes in the case where he thinks the speaker means all. And then there are two messages that the speaker can send, some or all. And some is true in both cases, and all is only true in one. That's what the check marks mean. Okay, so this is meant to be a sort of simple model of the context of utterance that sort of represents speakers' goals. But on its own, it doesn't tell us how the receiver ought to interpret the sender. So in order to show what the receiver should do and show that the receiver should calculate the implicature two when he hears message one, typically what game theoretic pragmatics will do is we need to select an equilibrium that serves as a solution to the game, which will specify which actions are optimal or full, rational in the setting that we've just seen in the context. So this game, there are a bunch of different equilibrium concepts that we can use, but this game has two Pareto optimal strict equilibria. So there are basically two equilibria that are better for at least one person and no worse for anyone else. Those are just the two cases where utilities are aligned. Those are also Nash equilibria. But what's a sort of interesting fact about this is that there are two Pareto optimal strict equilibria, but only one in which speakers use the words only in ways that are true. So they only say true things. So basically this solution concept doesn't narrow down the speaker's behavior adequately, but if we add the constraint that speakers speak truly, then it does. So that's why I have it, they're called semantic Pareto optimal strict equilibria. So this solution concept singles out what the behavior, what the rational or the optimal behavior is for both sender and receiver. It's that the sender sends the message some in the case, sends the message some in the case where he's seen some but not all of Bob's children, and then the receiver interprets him or undertakes action some but not all in just that case. And then similarly, in the case where the speaker sees all of the children, he sends the message, I've seen them all, and the audience or the receiver undertakes action, I've seen them all. So they basically, their utilities are such that this equilibrium forces them to speak exactly as we would imagine. So some is interpreted as some, not all, and all is interpreted as all. So that sort of is a way of representing a certain kind of reasoning on the part of sender and receiver, that this is what the optimal thing is to do in a game of this kind, or in a context of this kind. So here I've spelled out the reasoning. So the sender is cooperative. So this is the kind of reasoning that the receiver might go through, that this equilibrium tries to formalize. So so the sender is cooperative. He wants the receiver to take action, some but not all, only if he is of action, or is of type some but not all. So he wants the speaker to come to know that he's seen some but not all, only if that's right, only if that's the case. But given that some is true in both states, true in the some but not all and the all state, sending some does not single out the speaker's type, right? It wouldn't give the receiver any information at all. So given that, if the speaker were of the all type, he would have sent the message all, but he didn't. So he must not be of that type. He must be of type some but not all. So you can reason from the fact that the speaker didn't say the stronger thing, which would have been which would have been better for his purposes if he were of the all type, to the fact that he must be of the some but not all type. So you can come to some interpretation on the basis of reasoning about what would have been optimal for the speaker had he been of this other type. And then you can figure out that he wasn't of that type. So you can use some counterfactual reasoning. Okay, but now, as we know, often people want to mislead. And so in these contexts, our utilities or our goals are not always perfectly aligned. So consider the same exact game, except the utilities have been changed to represent the fact that there's a partial conflict of interest here. So the only difference is that when the speaker is of type all, if the receiver takes him to be of type some but not all, that gives a payoff of 1 for the sender and 0 for the receiver. But if the receiver finds out or comes to know or correctly determines that the sender is of type all, in the case where he is of type all, then the sender gets nothing and the receiver gets 1. So it's better for the receiver. So here, the sender doesn't want to be found out. The sender wants the receiver to take him to mean, so basically doesn't want him to find out that he's in fact seen all of Bob's children. Okay. So this is a situation in which no matter what, the sender is going to send the message, I saw some of Bob's children, right? He's never going to send the message all, because that would never get him anything. It would get him 0 in either case. So in this case, if the receiver knows that the payoffs are as they are, that it's always better for the receiver, that it's better for the sender to send the message some, no matter what no matter what's true, then he'll know that the receiver will know that the sender sends that message no matter what, and then won't be able to reason counterfactually about what he would have done in the case where he actually saw all of Bob's children. So in this case where the utilities are misaligned, you can't engage, the receiver can't engage in that counterfactual reasoning, can't engage in thinking like, well, if he would have seen them all, he would have said so, right? So that undermines the actual, the ability for the speaker to come to infer, to calculate this implicature. So the receiver, actually there's this technical concept called credibility. The receiver will not take the message that the sender sends, if it's the message some, to be credible, because he would have said it no matter what, right? That's the idea of credibility, is that credibility is, a message is credible if you say it only if it were true, right? But here, clearly, the speaker would say it no matter what. Therefore, the message, some but not all, is not credible, or the interpretation, some but not all, is not credible. Okay, so the basic way I want to implement or sort of represent manipulative speech is as an attempt on the part of the speaker to get the receiver to think that they are actually in a cooperative game. So here what we have are the two games, the cooperative game and the game of partial conflict, and then we have a probability distribution over the two games. So you have Q is the probability that the receiver's credence that the game is cooperative, and 1 minus Q is the receiver's credence that the game is a game of partial conflict. So we have this probability distribution, and the speaker is doing everything in his power to get the audience or get the receiver to think that they're in the cooperative case. Because in that case, if he sends the message some, even if he's in type all, right? Even if he is actually of type all, then the receiver will calculate the implicature that he did not see all of Bob's children, which is exactly what he wants, right? Exactly what will get him the payoffs. So I'm assuming basically that, so imagine then that the payoffs are actually as they are in the game of partial conflict, and the sender is trying to get the receiver to believe that the payoffs are as they are in the cooperative game. So suppose the actual payoffs are as they are in the partial conflict sum all game. The sender aims to convince the receiver that the payoffs are as they are in the cooperative game. If the receiver chooses an action that is not optimal for her, given the actual payoffs, given the non-cooperative game, on the basis of an overly high credence in the speaker's cooperativity, so an overly high value for Q, then the receiver has been manipulated. So they undertake an action on the basis of an over-assessment or a sort of overly high assessment of the speaker's cooperativity, and thereby draw an inference or calculate an implicature that they should not have drawn. In fact, what they should have done was nothing, given that the speaker would have said this no matter what, right? So if the receiver chooses an action on the basis of knowing the game, that it's a game of partial conflict, then they'll either do nothing or they'll randomize their action. So those are the best strategies for the receiver when they know that it's a game of partial conflict. So this is trying to represent the idea that speakers aim to deceive audiences about their goals for conversation. They're aiming to deceive audiences about their utilities or their payoffs in the game that they're playing. Well, at least it's keeping time. Sorry. Okay, I hope this is sort of making sense. I hope that it's not like too technical, or maybe it's trivial for some. I mean, it's probably trivial for some of you. Anyway, this is the kind of overarching view, and I know I'm basically running out of time, which is fine. So the idea here is that manipulation consists in fostering some kind of trust that the speaker is cooperative, and so trust that we're actually playing a cooperative game. And on the basis of one's belief, the receiver's belief that we're in a cooperative game, they're going to undertake actions that are in fact beneficial to the sender and not beneficial to them. So it's a kind of deception about the goals, or represented as deception about payoffs. Okay, so games of this kind can be constructed for basically all of the examples that I came up with before. So lying is simple. You just actually change the, you make it so that the message, isn't true in both of the states. And then you manipulate the payoffs in exactly the same way. And then a probability distribution over that game, or over those two games. The same thing for vagueness. So if I have a specific a general message and a specific message, and I want to get you to believe that I only have a certain kind of general knowledge, then I can choose a vague message. And if I can convince you that I'm fully cooperative, you'll think, oh, well, he's not actually in the the state where he has specific information. He only has general knowledge, because he's trying to convey everything that he knows. So basically, you can imagine a politician who gives a very general pronouncement, even though he knows some very specific fact about the world. If you presume cooperativity, a game of this kind will show that the audience will, if he can convince the audience that he's cooperative, the audience will think that he only has general knowledge, right? And won't presume that he's actually of the more specific type, where he has some specific piece of information that happens to be true when he says the general thing as well. So very similar to the sum all game, but one for vague expressions. And then you can, of course, put a probability distribution over those two games. And then this key thing will be that the speaker will try to say things that raise the audience's linguistic trust. So raise their credence that they're in the cooperative, that we're in the cooperative case. Okay. So these are the kind of morals, and then I'll stop. Sorry, I'm already a couple of minutes past. So I think that these kinds of games provide a normal form, or like a kind of just very, very simple general form for modeling manipulative speech, and they can be extended to lots more cases. So cases where the messages, the sort of set of messages is quite large. Then we have a representation of what linguistic trust is. It's to assign Q a high value, or that's a sort of measure of linguistic trust. It may or may not be rational, depending on your depending on your views about trust and defaults and presumptions. Speakers can influence Q. They can foster linguistic trust in a range of insidious ways by like choosing the down home folksy message, or speaking. And the features of messages can actually influence the degree to which an audience trusts you. And then upon hearing a message, audiences will update both their conception of how trustworthy you are and also their priors about the state of the world, about what's actual, and then they'll choose an action. So the idea is that messages have these two functions. They influence how much an audience will trust you, and then they give the audience some new information about the state of the world. And then on the basis of those two facts, they'll go on to choose an act, basis of their assessment of what the world is like and what the speaker is like, they will go on to choose an action. And if they're wrong about the trustworthiness of the speaker, then they will end up choosing an action that's more optimal for the speaker, or better for the speaker and worse for them, because they've been deceived about the utilities of the speaker. Okay, so that's the general model. Yeah, so I will leave it there. If you want to talk about propaganda later, we can talk about propaganda. But anyway, thanks very much. I'm sort of interested to hear your thoughts. No need to. It's fine. Everyone's like, hands. This is wrong.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you. That was really good. Yeah. So we'll just do as we normally do. So just raise hands and go from there. And as usual, if anyone has a question that's related to a question that's already being asked, just message me in the chat, and we'll take it from there.
Should I leave my screen shared?
I can resend the presentation now maybe just in case anyone joined later, and maybe you can stop sharing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just sent the presentation. Okay, so yeah, we can start with Emilia.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't think my hand up went up first, so I was still kind of formulating in my head. But I'm basically wondering, a really interesting talk, by the way. I find the kind of backdoor speech acts, covert speech stuff really interesting. I'm less familiar with the formalized stuff. And I'm wondering about the kind of, you mentioned that we want to move away from this idealization that the speakers in a conversation are trying to get to kind of a shared map of the world. They might be trying to do other things. But I'm wondering about the fact that there still seems to be the joint assumption of intentions in the manipulative speech, and that the relevant goal is kind of informational on the formal model. Because this is partly because I'm interested in the propaganda side. It seems like sometimes we have this kind of speech which you kind of put out there in the world, and it's going to be replicated by people who don't necessarily have those intentions, even if it's having the effects, and cases where it's not clear that what I'm trying to do is going to be informational rather than some kind of like effective behavioral salience manipulating thing. So I'm wondering about to what extent those are quite idealized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a super good question. I will say that's so the same Ray Langton asked me that question like a few weeks ago. So she basically, so I think that there's something important. So one question is manipulative speech intentional? Is sort of manipulation always intentional? And another question is, can manipulative speech serve as the basis for a theory of propaganda if the theory of manipulative speech is intentional? Because clearly propaganda is not always intentional, right? Propaganda has these sort of downstream effects that are like, wild and unpredictable and certainly unintended. So I think that for the purposes of a theory of manipulation and manipulative speech, I think that there's something important about intentions. Like, I don't think that we would count a sort of accidental instance of repeating, for instance, a dog whistle as manipulative, at least in the same way as somebody who's doing this sort of deliberately. But I do think that you can have covertly non-cooperative speech, right? It just won't be, so it's the same in effect because it's non-cooperative, right? It's not optimal for the audience's goal, and they don't recognize that it's not optimal for their goal. But it won't qualify, so it's the same kind of in effect, but it won't qualify as strategic and it won't qualify as manipulative because I've defined both of those concepts in terms of intentions. So what we can do is make a distinction and say that between strategic speech and sort of non-optimal speech for the purposes of conversation or something like that. And so we can allow that there's speech that mimics manipulative speech in its effects, but is not itself manipulative because manipulation requires intention. And then the informational bit, look, that's an idealization. In the paper, I've written a little bit about what we might do if we want to relinquish that idealization or sort of de-idealize. I think that even the unintentional stuff will have some informational content, but it's just going to be that it won't be. So if the audience's goal is to come to have knowledge about, have knowledge about a particular question, then it's going to be that it's not sort of informationally optimal for them, right? A dog whistle is not, an answer to, it's not an optimal answer to the question under discussion, for instance. So there's something kind of, there's something deficient about it. And the speaker could have chosen a better message. And given that, so I'm not, what I'm trying to say is I'm not sure that the informational component is the thing that will sort of distinguish, I'm not sure how closely connected it is to the intentional, non-intentional distinction, maybe. I hope that's a partial answer, but that's a great question in it. And it's one like the issue about unintentional manipulation or unintentional sort of strategic speech is one that I have to like take up if I'm going to turn this into a theory of propaganda, for instance.
Thanks.
Thanks. Justin?
All right, thanks a lot. Very cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, whenever these issues about conversation come up, I start thinking about like trying to talk to certain family members that I have.
I thought you might.
And so, I mean, often conversations, if they're really about some real topic and like they are one of these like attempts to share private knowledge, they can feel more like competitions than cooperative kind of. And so often what you'll do, like if you go home for Christmas or whatever, is you'll have a conversation, but the goal is just, and neither of you thinks the goal is sharing any kind of knowledge necessarily, right? The goal is like, let's pass the time, let's have a nice Christmas, whatever. And so if you kind of relax that assumption that the goal of every conversation is like sharing of private knowledge, then, one interesting thing that seems to open up is like the possibility of manipulative speech, where it seems like you're being cooperative with respect to that goal.
Yeah.
But the manipulative speech then doesn't have to try and be getting the person to think anything incorrect or anything. Like I might just try and like sneak in, and what I want is like for my dad to go get vaccinated, but I would never just say that, right? I would never like, yeah. Okay. So I just wondered.
You're not even talking about vaccination. Yeah.
Wondered if you had thought anything about that.
Well, I think basically that you're right. So that's just a concession. So one of the things is that the Griceans operate with this strong presumption, right? And all of the modeling that goes on has this presumption built into it, right? Like the common ground, the conversational scoreboard, every game theoretic model ever created. There just basically are no models that don't operate with the kind of informational or knowledge sharing goal. But I basically think that it's a drastic idealization, and that in fact we can, even Grice says that like we can, make conversation to amuse ourselves or to like bond or to, and none of that is going to operate by sort of, sharing knowledge first and foremost. Right? We might so we could, coordinate on a particular task or whatever. So I basically think that the goal of sharing knowledge is overly restrictive, and that there could be any goal could play that role. But the same story will apply in exactly, so whatever the goal is that you choose, the key part of the theory is just that you can deceive people about what goal you're actually pursuing with an instance of speech, and make them think that you're pursuing the goal that you both sort of have, think, or, at least they think is the goal of the conversation. So that's kind of why in those definitions, I actually left G and G star schematic, because I wanted to allow for that possibility. But I did, it's hard. There are like, it gets complicated if you start countenancing too many goals. It's nice and simple if you keep it like knowledge, and then something that conflicts with sharing knowledge. That's like the kind of, anyway. But
yeah, good. Yes. Yeah. That's what one nice thing about this sort of schematic model, as you say, is you can just sort of plug in whatever goal you want. And then it just gets a little bit tricky. Like, I think as you were doing it, sorry, I was like folding laundry while you were doing that, but I think it was like, this is correct or it's incorrect. Right. And you have to figure out what the two kinds of values could be if the goal is not like sharing knowledge, right? And I guess that's what you're saying. That's where it can get a little bit kind of tricky.
Right. Well, it's sort of like, it's really easy to calculate what's optimal for somebody. So if you think of like whether something is cooperative as being an optimality calculation, like it's about expected utilities basically. And usually expected utilities involve some probability or some credence about, which state the world is in, and some, utility if the world turns out to be in that state. So then when we're talking about, what's optimal for you, we have to have, it has to be like about the state of the world, and then, some utility that happens in that. So then things get more complicated when we're not talking about these kind of, states with where we have credences credences and utilities in that state. So yes, it's going to get more complicated. The calculations are going to look, I mean, weird. But like, yeah, in principle, that's what I would like is to have a general theory of that sort. But one of my frustrations, I think, is that the formal machinery that we have is in many ways quite limiting. And I'm just trying to generalize the formal machinery in one specific way, and then hopefully allow, like slowly, expand the case, to make it slightly more realistic, because signaling games are not realistic. They're little tiny bits of conversation, right? So hopefully together we can kind of get a more general theory of what conversation looks like. Thanks, Justin. That's really cool.
Victor?
Yes, thanks, Justin. Yeah, I'm interested in related issues and types of speech. So yeah, that was really good for me. I have several questions, but maybe I'll start with this one. So manipulative speech is when the speaker pursues a non-communicative goal that is in conflict with the general goal of sharing knowledge, and is not open about pursuing that goal. And
Right.
so strategic speech and manipulative speech can come apart. So in principle, you can have strategic speech that is non-manipulative when the speaker is transparent, open about pursuing some further non-communicative goal. So I was just wondering if you had examples in mind, if it was just a possibility in principle, because I sort of thought about bold-faced lying as an example of strategy speak that is open about pursuing a conflicting goal. Yeah.
That's certainly one leading example. I think there are quite a few more bald-faced lying situations, like in court. So I think in court, basically any case where there's a background of common knowledge of opposing interests, which there will be many. So many political situations will be, I think, strategic but not manipulative, or at least there'll be some kind of mixture of strategic and manipulative. Basically, there will be some background assumption that this is a non-cooperative setting, and then the audience is going to estimate or going to try to come up with some sort of estimate of how cooperative the speaker is being, right, or how likely they are to cooperate. But yeah, so one case would be bald-faced lying. Another case would just be refusing to give a full answer, right? So refusing to provide the information that people want when they know that you know the full answer. Other cases are, trying to change the subject, right? In a case where it's so topic change, but in a when it's common knowledge that you're trying to change the topic. Sometimes that can be successful because of other norms or conversational pressures, right? So sometimes this will interact with the politeness considerations or various other kinds of considerations where, like, as in the case of bald-faced lying, it'll put pressure on the conversation to go in a particular way because you don't want to come out and say you're a liar, or stop trying to change the subject. But everybody knows what's going on. It's just that there are some other pressures around that make that successful anyway. So yeah, I basically think that it's a kind of overtness issue and common knowledge. There will be many cases in which it's basically out and out that the speaker is being strategic and their speech may be successful anyway.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for that. Thanks for your question.
I'll just go
I'm
ahead.
happy to talk about this.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll go ahead with my question now. And then Nick. Yeah, it's more of a definitional question and related kind of to what Victor and Justin were saying in a way, but not exactly. On the way you're defining manipulative speech. So there's a definition, all right, the distinction that you present between strategic and manipulative. But then there was, or at least I kind of interpreted a distinction between the initial first slide, something like that, of manipulative speech, and then further on, specifically on whether it's just the covert nature of it that makes it manipulative, or whether the final goal of the speaker is also taken into account. So whether, I mean, we were talking about vaccinations beforehand. So maybe, I might be having a conversation with someone who's an anti-vaxxer, and in some way, I can't really think of, what the speech would involve, but in some way, I might be manipulating the individual to get a vaccine. So that's my goal. And I'll be doing it in a manipulative way. So I'm not being, not stating facts maybe about, how good the vaccine is, but I'm, I don't know, trying to manipulate in some way. It's kind of like the example sort of we gave before of them giving out money to get vaccinated. I mean, you sort of.
Yeah, right.
So what specifically is the criteria that makes the speech manipulative? Is it just the covert nature of it? Or does the intention of the speaker or the final goal of the speaker come into play? Does that goal necessarily have to be a negative goal or something that harms the receiver?
Right. So this is a good point. It definitely does not have. So I think that there are many cases of paternalistic manipulation, in cases where you're manipulating people into doing something that is for their own good, that is in their interest, like in the objective sense. But what I do think has to happen is that you have to do something that conflicts with their immediate goal for the conversation, right? So here's an example. I think it is sometimes not only permissible, but even morally required to manipulate your children. And that's the only way to get them to, it might be the only way to get your children to go to sleep, right? Like tell them that, like, I don't know, get them to like race around the house to tire themselves out, and then like they fall into bed or something, you can't force them, you can't tie them down, and you can't reason with them either. I mean, I can't reason with children usually, but the issue is that you still have the action that you take in conversation, at least, is at least in some way in tension with what their goal is for the conversation, right? Now, or what they take to be in there. So forget speech for a minute. In just the case of manipulation, I think that you have to go against what somebody takes to be in their interest, right? And that's what I mean by goal. So I'm using goal in the sort of internalist sense of interest or desires or whatever, right? As in, what people think is best for them. And so you're in conflict with that covertly, right? And of course, you're in conflict with that covertly because you're pursuing some goal that is in fact good for them that they may not have, right? That they may not sort of be pursuing. So that's the kind of idea, is that covertness is important and the goal is important, but it's just that where the conflict lies is with the sort of immediate goal of the conversation that the speaker knows is their goal for the conversation, and likewise for non-linguistic manipulation.
Thanks. Nick.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. That was really interesting. I was sort of wondering what you would say about sort of cases where speakers might choose certain words rather than others because of connotations, but on the face of it, or still appearing to be fully, or while that is still sort of consistent with being fully cooperative. So I was thinking about like this sales case, and saying the person selling the piece of furniture is asked, can you tell me something more about the kind of about this piece of furniture? and they say, oh, it's blah, 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 it's a nice antique thing or something like that. And they choose the word antique rather than the word old to sort of suggest that it's valuable. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like they're, or at least I'm not directly seeing where they're being non-cooperative in choosing the word antique rather than the word old, when they're specifically asked to give more information about this piece of furniture.
Yeah, great question. So this is something I've thought about a little bit, and I hope I have. I mean, this is something I need to develop an answer to. But so considerations of style or diction or word choice. So the first question might be, are those manipulative? Right, and so one thought is that so just consider a fully cooperative case, right? Forget the sales case. Let's just think about a case where we're just communicating. Now, suppose I choose one word rather than another, right? And that will sort of be more, conducive to conveying information. There's something maybe covert there, right? But maybe it's like not, but so there's something kind of deceptive maybe about, word choice or whatever, at least because we don't know what other word you might have chosen. So is there something kind of manipulative there or something, wrong already in the cooperative case? And then of course, in the sales case, we're of course going to choose certain kinds of words that, lead to me selling you something. But that might be a case in which, I'm genuinely, well, so if you define optimality in this information theoretic way, or sort of optimal for sort of expected utility, you might not be able to make that distinction, right? So my feeling, so the answer I gave to my friend who was also pushing me on a similar question was that I think that word choice in and of itself is not manipulative. Like, so just because, like, so what you're ignorant of, or what it seems like the audience is ignorant of when you choose one word rather than another, is something about like what the alternative messages might have been, right? And that can be important, but as long as the sort of, the words are sort of equally good for sort of pursuing a certain kind of, that they're equally cooperative, depending on how exactly we spell out cooperative, then I think it's not going to be manipulative, right? It's just going to be some sort of, it might be deception about the means by which you achieve your goal, right? Or it might not be, or a sort of not fully transparent feature of the way you achieve your goal. And so one thing, this is just to say something slightly a related point, that my friend, also named Nick, interestingly, was asking me about, so suppose you're a politician and you're in a fully cooperative situation, but you use some sort of down-home folksy language, right? Or you kind of use the, you sort of speak the vernacular, right? Like Hillary Clinton trying to speak Ebonics or trying to speak African-American English. And then you're sort of found out, right? That it turns out that like, we know you're not being authentic. Is that an instance of manipulation? And I told him I didn't think it was, so long as the goals were aligned, like truly aligned. So long as I was really trying to share knowledge with you. Just because, you might think that it's just a result of the general exhortation to be authentic or something like that. They might feel kind of deceived that you've been inauthentic, but that could happen in any number of ways, right? Mode of dress. Anyway, so my feeling is that I don't want to say that in and of itself, choosing one word rather than another is manipulative. But I think that in the right cases where there are the right kinds of differences between those words, then maybe it would be.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Emilia?
Thanks. I think you might have kind of just answered this. So sorry if this is repetitive, but I was wondering about a kind of related case. And I have to admit, this is a slightly selfish, I've been thinking about these kind of cases and I'm curious if you have thoughts on them.
Cool.
So kind of related cases where I am trying to give you some kind of true belief. So I kind of share your goal, but I'm maybe doing it in slightly underhanded ways. So I think one example might be, so let's say the vaccine case, suppose that like a public health body can decide different ways of presenting the statistics of how good vaccines are. And they can use a like 1 in N chance kind of presentation, or they can use a like 5,000% kind of presentation. And they know that people aren't super like numerically literate. So they know that using this kind of presentation is going to make it seem much scarier and much more important to get the vaccine. So they choose that one.
Yeah,
and then there's not necessarily false information there. And this person is trying to get accurate information. So it's not clear you're misleading them, but there is something surreptitious going on. And then in the more kind of surreptitious case, I'm interested in like, so in conceptual engineering, there's this puzzle about, okay, you think a word should mean something. So you kind of want to go about using a word this way, but it isn't necessarily how other people use it. Yeah. But you think there's a reason to use it that way. So for instance, suppose I think sexual harassment should have a fairly inclusive definition, but I know that a lot of people use it more restrictedly. Right. So maybe I say, oh, such and such was sexually harassed. And it's going to license a bunch of reasonable inferences on your end. It's going to give you way more true beliefs than false beliefs, but maybe bundled up in that is also going to be a false inference about what actually occurred. And so I'm curious about these cases because it kind of seems like I'm giving you mostly reasonable or accurate beliefs, but I may be doing it in a slightly underhand way, and maybe there's some kind of like unreasonable inference bundled in there. And I'm curious about the kind of status of these kind of exchanges.
Interesting. Okay, so let me see the one that I think is easiest to address first, or like maybe we can think through it together. So, so the case where, like, okay, I was imagining the statistics were something like that. You could, so imagine framing effects, right? Mm-hmm. Framing effects are you could present it in one of two ways. You kind of predictably know that it's going to have an effect on someone, in one direction, just because of some background facts about them or whatever. It's not that one is sort of obviously more, so imagine that they're both relatively transparent, right? So this isn't like a jargon sort of thing, right? I'm not like trying to beguile you or trying to stupefy you or anything, right? It's just that we know there's this causal difference between these two words. So in that case, it seems to me like what's going on is there's some means that like you're hiding the means of achieving your goal, even though your goal might be shared, and even though you might know, even though the audience might know that we all share the same goal, right? There's also this other consideration about how you sort of contribute to the goal of conversation, or how your utterance achieves that goal. And well, so one thing that sometimes people do, and that actually I didn't do for a variety of reasons that are like kind of weird and technical and not, but there's a condition in the publicity principle that, so the publicity principle could be stated as make public which speech act you're engaged in, what your goal in undertaking that speech act is, and how that speech act contributes to the goal of conversation, right? So that's a much stronger condition, right? And if you have to make public how your utterance contributes to the goal of conversation, like it threatens to render most speech not public, basically, right? So I mean that might be actually one way of sort of thinking about both your question and Nick's, is that you're both pushing on this potential added condition to publicity, which would say that you need to make clear how your goal, your sort of utterance or bit of speech is achieving this goal of giving these people this knowledge, or giving them true beliefs at least. So I'm sort of inclined to think that that's an extraordinarily strong condition on sort of public speech, or because it could be, that might narrow down the acceptable, things to say to like one, right? You might have no room to say anything. But I mean, that is one way of thinking about the way that framing effects operate, is that they bring about their certain goals, but by kind of clandestine means and that we, even if we know we share a goal, you might be doing something like choosing words strategically or choosing words like carefully in order to sort of bring about the effect more readily. That's just what efficient communicators do, right? Good communicators, they choose their words carefully. I didn't want to say that good communicators, people who choose words carefully and are like good writers, are ipso facto violating a norm of conversation, right? I didn't want to say that. But I mean, it's a good case. So the second case is interesting. So you're like deliberately using a word that sort of intending it to mean something broader than you know your audience means, or you know your audience takes it to mean. Yeah. And so they might actually infer things that are not true on the basis of that about, you know, you or whatever, right? You, yeah. So I don't know exactly what to say about that. I don't know if it qualifies as manipulative, but it's extremely interesting in the sense that it is a clear violation of publicity, right? You're using a word in a way that you know your audience is going to kind of misunderstand. So this is actually interesting. There's this famous line from Stallnacher who says that you basically can't. I'm gonna butcher it, but you can't intend to be misunderstood, because the effect that you want to bring about is exactly what is sort of is importantly or essentially connected to exactly what it is that you mean. And so this is a situation in which that looks like it's under pressure. And I think that that's false, in fact, that you can't intend to be misunderstood. And I think I mean, I have another paper, and actually there's a paper by Elliot Michelson recently published like a couple months ago called Sneaky Reference, or something about, I forget exactly the title, but it has sneaky reference in the title, and it denies exactly that principle, that you can't intend to be misunderstood. Now, I don't know if that's exactly your case, but it's closely related, right? So you're using something in a way that sort of is going to be misunderstood in order to bring about some other goal, right? Which is kind of, anyway, it's a very interesting case. I'm not sure if I've said anything useful about it, but I'll have to think about it more. I am kind of interested in these conceptual engineering topics, like, you know, whether that situation even makes sense on a kind of Stallnacher picture, right? Where the known effect is what you mean by the thing, right? So you might look at his sneaky reference paper because he has this situation in which you like intend to mean something and know that somebody's going to take you to mean something else. But he argues, I think convincingly, that you still mean the first thing. So your sort of foreseen effect or whatever is not the meaning. And he takes that to be a counterexample to Grice and to Stallnacher. So anyway, that's my a little bit of free association, but it's a really interesting case.
Thanks, that's super helpful. Yeah, because I guess I was wondering kind of when you have the false ones bundled in with more true ones. So it's not even the final goal, it's like, because then the numerical case might have less baggage. So like, let's suppose we know people, when they hear there's been a 3,000% increase, do not think that is much more than there's been a 30 times increase. We know that like quite a few people are going to make that mistaken inference, but we know that overall they're going to get a like, on average, more accurate image of the world. So there's kind of like, I don't know, like if you gave them a version of the numbers that they wouldn't draw mistaken inferences from, maybe on the whole, their image of the world would be like less accurate or reasonable.
Right. That could be an instance of paternalistic manipulation too, right? It could be, I mean, if you're really sure that one message is going to, kind of convey knowledge to them, say their goal is to like gain, but it's like one sort of conflicts with their immediate conversational goal and you kind of know it. I mean, it might not be this, then it might be a case of paternalistic manipulation, but otherwise it might just be sort of a lack of perfect transparency about the means that you achieve that goal. So I think that those are kind of closely related, and depending on whether or not the message is actually better for one message is actually better than another for achieving their goal, it will go into one category or the other.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Victor?
Yes, I want to return to the definition of strategic speech. So because the non-communicative goal of the speaker must conflict with the general goal of sharing knowledge, but sometimes you've also spoken of the speaker's goal, non-communicative goal, conflicting with the hearer's goal, which is just equated with the goal of sharing knowledge. So I was wondering if it was just because you assume cases in which the hearer was cooperative in this sense, was following this general aim of conversation, but actually what's more fundamental for the conflict is a conflict with this general goal and not the goal of the hearer, whatever it is. So because so what I had in mind is cases in which all participants are not cooperative or are pursuing goals that are not the goal of sharing knowledge, and maybe in a sense that their sort of anti-cooperative goals could be aligned in some sense. For example, they both want to set up a conflict with the other participants, and of course the more distal aim is different. One wants to set up conflict to their advantage and the other to their own advantage, but at least it's aligned in the sense. And yeah, but it seems that the speech could still be strategic. So is the more fundamental thing the conflict with the general goal of sharing knowledge, or the conflict with the aims of the other participants?
So this is a really good question. It's something that I've been struggling with a little bit. So my initial thought when I first wrote the paper was that what mattered was that you're non-cooperative, and where cooperative is neutral between goals. So what matters is just that it's you have a goal, the other person has a goal. Whatever that goal is, if you are not cooperative with their goal, and you pursue some other goal that conflicts with what you know is their goal, then you're speaking strategically. That was how I spelled it out originally. I still think that I'm still drawn to that, partly because I think that the idea that conversation is sort of made to share knowledge is artificial. So there's a big conflict about this among Griceans, or among people working in a kind of broadly Gricean tradition. Like people like Stallnacher, Szabo, Grice himself, basically they all think that there's something important about sharing knowledge that's sort of built into conversation or constitutive, or it's a kind of strong connection between these goals and conversation. Other people like Asher and Laskaridis think that it doesn't matter what, the goal of conversation can be, if there is the notion of the goal of conversation, it's just that participants have goals for the conversation that happen to overlap, right? So the idea that there is a single goal for the conversation is a kind of artifact, or it's an abstraction from the goals of the participants. So I don't know if I hope I'm getting at the question that you're asking, because you'd think that if two or three people, or two people in a conversation are neither of them are concerned with sharing knowledge, then like, is the goal of their conversation still to share knowledge? Is that possible? And my intuition is to think no, that conversation can be for any purpose, or it's a much more sort of ecumenical notion of the goal of conversation. But I sometimes talk to people and they think that, well, if you're not sharing knowledge, you're doing something else. If you're not sort of, all the Stalnackerians say this. If you're not coordinating on a body of shared information and updating it, then you're actually not engaged in conversation. To me, that sounds a little bit crazy. And it also sounds crazy to me that there could be a conversation in which nobody had the goal of sharing knowledge, but it was still the goal of the conversation. It sounds a little bit weird to me. But maybe I'm just not a constitutivist about conversation in that way. I don't know. So this is something I just don't know the answer to. And the problem is that there are really strong feelings on both sides in the literature. And like, basically there's just this big disagreement, like the goal of conversation, you know, some people are like, what do you mean? And other people are like, you don't even, like, you might be engaged in something, but you're not engaged in conversation. So there's total unintelligibility. So I've tried to deal with this. I don't know. I tried to, I had a section and then I took it out because it was like, anyway, so I hope that at least expresses my own worries about the situation.
Okay, yeah, this sounds fair, but now I'm realizing that maybe the kind of example that I've just raised, is there an issue about the individuation of conversational goals? Like how far ingrained are they supposed to be? I mean, there's no intuitive problem. Intuitively, in most cases, we see where the goals conflict or not.
Yeah.
But is that sufficient, or should we sort of?
No, it's not sufficient for a formal theory. I mean, but interestingly, for the most part, formal theories don't use the notion that the game theoretic tools that we have don't even invoke the notion of a goal, right? What they invoke is the notion of they have a utility and they are, you know, a payoff in a particular state. So they have utility functions, but they don't actually, so those utility functions are supposed to represent goals. You know, but they don't have the idea of, you know, the goal of a particular activity. They just have states of the world and way, you know, how good they are for you. And that you might think that you could extract a notion. So one thing that game theorists say a lot of times is, well, the goal is to share information because, as we see in the game, the utilities are aligned for the situation where the speaker is of one type and the receiver comes to believe that they're of that type, right? Truly. Anyway, so I'm not sure how to do this formally. I think intuitively it's clear that I mean, goals might be context sensitive, right? In one, you know, it might be that we can kind of isolate a goal for any particular conversation or for any particular speaker in a conversation. And then we could define strategic speech with respect to a particular, I mean, here's a slight modification of the theory. Define strategic speech as speech that is not fully cooperative with respect to a goal G, where we leave that schematic. And then we say, okay, so now if the audience, suppose, has that goal, then we can define strategic speech with respect to that goal as speech that pursues a goal that conflicts with it. So that's another possibility that tries to avoid the issue of, you know, exactly what the goals of conversation are. So I don't have a perfect answer to this question. Like, there seem to be problems on both sides. Like, one option is to say, yes, it's just sharing knowledge. The other is to say, well, just speakers have a bunch of goals and there can be many of them operative at any time in conversation. But in that case, in the latter case, it's hard to define strategic speech and hard to define manipulative speech. So maybe what you do is just parameterize it, make it, you know, use the goal as a parameter in the definition, and then define manipulation with respect to that goal.
Okay, thank you. I'll think about it.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that. That's a really, I mean, super right on question. So thanks for that.